America. Now I'm seeing all of a sudden a lot of Africans going like, yo, you got some of that reparations? So California is finally looking into reparations for ADOS people. Now, there are some good things in it in the task force, and there's some things that don't make a lot of sense, such as like a formal apology from the government of California, which is a weird one because I'm like, you guys historically didn't do anything. You weren't a slave state or anything. The apology should be coming from the federal government. Same with the California state government paying it out. It's a bit weird because I'm like, this is a sort of a federal issue. Because reparations is about ADOS, FBA versus the federal government. Not the people that tell you it's based on race. That's a lie. It's, like I said, ADOS and FBA versus the federal government. American descendants of slaves and foundational blacks versus the feds. Anybody who tells you otherwise, that it's about black people versus white people, they're lying to you, or they're trying to race bait you to get an emotional reaction. Both sides have been doing this. It's very infuriating. Anyway, overall, California, looking into it right now, they just decided it's going to be limited to anyone who's ADOS or was here before the 19th century. You just got to get your paperwork in order, which I've been doing. And the proposal for the actual reparations, like what will be handed out, will be seen, I think it's coming in 2023. Now, again, it's kind of weird that the California government is doing this because this is a federal issue, but either way, it's a start. However, there were concerns and other concerns in the bill, like I had like half the task force of 9 people, half are chosen by Newsom. I don't trust Newsom. Newsom has a very serious problem of saying one thing and doing another. Because he is the epitome of a neo-lib. For example, we all know the mask mandates, right? He doesn't listen to those. He tells everyone else to do it. He doesn't listen to those. Another example, environmental protections. He talks about how pro-environment he is. Meanwhile, recycling stations have been disappearing in California for years. He's trying to shut down our nuclear plant, and he took like 5 fracking contracts. And then he goes like, I'm for the environment. So Newsom, I don't trust him with this and who he appoints. Let me put it this way. It's like the government's going to pick how the government should pay out a debt that they owe. This is the same type of energy of the police investigating police brutality. So I'm sorry if I'm a little suspicious. Okay, so after more than 6 hours of debate on Tuesday, California's Reparation Task Force voted that only black Californians who can prove direct lineage to enslaved ancestors will be eligible for the statewide and first in the nation initiative to address harms enduring the legacy of slavery. Now, like I said, it's weird the California government's doing this because they weren't involved in that. Like I said, it's a federal issue, but okay, this is a start. The 9-member task force voted 5-4 in favor of defining eligibility for reparations based on lineage determined by individual being African American descendant of chattel enslaved person or the descendant of a free black person living in the U.S. prior to the end of the 19th century, which is more of at the time in the 1860s when the reparations debate was going on. That was more of the Republicans' view that not only should Southern blacks get slaves, or Southern blacks get reparations from slavery, but Northern blacks should get reparations too, because they weren't treated well up there either. That's what there was Republicans arguing for this after Lincoln died, and then Andrew Johnson he came out with all the excuses we still hear today. If you go back and read Andrew Johnson's excuses for trying to get out of reparations, it's the same stuff we hear today. The only one you don't hear from him back then was it was a long time ago, get over it. This was 1865 or 1866. He was pulling out it's unfair to give only a certain group of people financial compensation based on race. In 1866, he was arguing that. This man was trying to argue that race-based laws or race-based compensation was not okay in the 1860s when that was basically all America was doing up until this point. Amazing. Now, here's my problem with some of the people in the reparations debate. You had a lot of people who were African now. And all of a sudden, problem is, a lot of people who tended to have ancestry from Africa here, what I mean is like, couple generations in, we're usually the ones saying reparations a handout, you don't need it, you're lazy. Like, anybody who thinks there's been like this unity between the African Americans and the native black Americans, no, there's been a lot of tension there. Now I'm seeing all of a sudden a lot of Africans going like, yo, you got some of that reparations? When there's a tangible there, when a tangible's coming, now all of a sudden they're like, yo, we're all in this together, we're all black. It changed real quick when some sort of tangible was in reach. You notice that? So they tried to go for a broader definition for all people of any sort of African ancestry in California, with special consideration for anyone who is ADOS. And that basically was a no-go. And I think rightfully so, that was a no-go. Now, anytime there's any kind of tangibles to helping black people or paying, again, what is owed, what do you think happens? You have the Republican ignorants coming out, throwing out their straw men against it, where they have no clue about anything that happened in that time period. They're the ones who always like rag on the left, saying they don't know their history. And then anytime reparations come up, you see that these Republicans don't know the history behind it at all. I'm like, neither the left or the right understand the history there. I don't like the left just as much. I think they were just as toxic for reparations as the right. Arguably, the left was more so toxic because, left-wing media props up their tap dancers who will bring up this like nonsense about it's about getting back at white people, which then the right is reactive to the left and then attacks that argument instead of the actual argument behind it. Because often when I see Republicans trying to refute reparations, I see them responding to like these moronic lefties who are propped up by like mainstream media and stuff like that, and it's like they don't have any idea what they're talking about either. But see, as a lot of times what happens, as I'm going to show you real quick, whenever Republicans have to try and refute reparations, a lot of times you can see they have very heavy negative racial prejudices towards black people start to come out. And maybe they notice it, maybe they don't. Some intentional, some out of ignorance. To wrap up, I might just touch on a couple of the talking points I've been hearing that are, historically inaccurate, incorrect, misleading. And like I said, a lot of these, I've talked to a lot of these, like kind of white Republicans, even black Republicans who don't know the history. When they say they're against reparations, I just start asking some questions, and you start to realize they never learned the history behind it. So they're against it, but they really don't know why they're against it. Or the reason they're against it is based on a lot of falsehoods.
California has become the first state to implement an actual reparations scheme for black people. We've talked about it for years. This goes back to that old promise of 40 acres and a mule for the freed slaves. That didn't happen. There have been.
Yes, that reparations should be about land. Right now, California hasn't said. We're not going to know until next year what the actual proposal will be. But yes, that is a debt the federal government took out for people who were, for the free slaves that they never paid off. That debt does not go away overnight. You can't just wait out the debt and then go, oh, the debt's disappeared. You can't do that. Especially because, on a side note, I even saw a comment that was so diluted that it just shows some people don't know history. I even saw a comment, it was saying, there was a white guy saying, I'm a descendant of a slave owner. Where's my reparations for the slaves that were taken from my family for compensation? And I'm like, that literally happened. That's the Emancipation Compensation Act. Just kind of goes to show you how many people don't know the history of it.
In effect, a lot of reparations programs over the years.
There's never been a slavery reparations program, ever. Historically, there has never been one. That's what
a lot of the civil rights programs were about. The New Society, Great Society programs were about.
Those had nothing to do with correcting slavery. A lot of those were actually traps. A lot of the welfare state stuff from the 1960s, a lot of that was a trap. I mean, I have a controversial opinion. I think that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a bit of a monkey's paw. There was good stuff in there, but a lot of people look at you weird if you say, yo, there was some bad stuff in there too. Right? And even Republicans acknowledge this with a lot of the welfare stuff that happened later. Like, you had people, idiots like Candace Owens saying welfare was an attack on the black family. And I'm like, so you do believe systemic racism exists? It can't exist only when Democrats do it. It either exists or it doesn't exist. But no, welfare programs had nothing to do with that.
That's what a lot of the affirmative action programs were about. So there has...
So one more thing. Let me just debunk this real quick. Welfare had nothing to do with reparations for slavery at all. Affirmative action had nothing to do with reparations for slavery. If that was true, white, like these, poor white people, they go on welfare. Affirmative action largely helps women. All women. It's not for ADOS women. Right? Welfare's not for ADOS families. It's for everybody can get access to it. So that's not specifically addressing people who are ADOS, FBA ADOS people, which slavery reparations would do. So no, this is a completely different argument. This is derailing and going off in a completely different direction.
There's been a lot of money spent on de facto reparations.
The has to use a different word because that's not what it was.
But until now, we haven't really seen direct checks to black people just for being black people, hundreds of years after slavery.
Again, here we go. Direct checks to black people for being... No. It's for FBA ADOS. Not all black people get it. Africans ain't getting it.
Well, now we're seeing that in California. This California task force has okayed reparations for direct descendants of enslaved black people. But this doesn't make a lot of sense. This doesn't. One, because people tend to have mixed race, and there were black slaveholders.
There's black slaveholders, and there were Jewish Nazis too. And I'm always sick of that talking point. Like, it was like, it's the same thing with like, Africans enslaved you too. It's like chattel slavery and African slavery were not the same. And I'm like, and how does that relieve anybody of any sort of responsibility? And again, in terms of responsibility, I'm referring to the federal government, not white people, because a lot of white people feel attacked, going like, why am I paying for my descendants? And I'm like, no, it's nothing about you. There's no guilt on any white people living today over slavery, none at all. None of you should feel guilty for it. And if anyone tells you that, that is nonsense. Don't listen to them. You can't help what your ancestors did, so don't even worry about that.
Ironically, the first officially determined owner of an African slave for life in America was a black guy himself. He was a black Angolan guy.
Again, that has nothing to do with anything. That's just there to poison the well.
So it would be very difficult to parse out exactly who gets the reparations. But moreover, the argument from the left...
Well, that's not exactly true, because how this would work is, now I've had back and forth, because originally I was not for mixed people getting reparations, and then I talked to more people, and I was like, all right, no, that makes sense. So, yeah, mixed people should get reparations, mixed ADOS people, depending, obviously there's a limit. You're not going to have the people that come and go like, I'm 1/16th. It's like, that's a bit different. That's way off. But yeah, there's actually not that many, to be honest, there's not that many pure ADOS people left. A lot of my friends were half FBA, like American black mom, African dad. But no, they would be part of this too up until a certain cutoff point, which again we'll figure that out next year. So
reparations. But moreover, the argument from the left on white supremacy and intersectionality and critical race theory is that racism and the effects of slavery don't only affect the descendants of black slaves, it affects all black people.
Okay, so see how he switched things up? He switched things up to racism affects all black people. We're like, yeah, but we're not talking about that. If you want to talk about even like, say, reparations for Jim Crow laws, that would be a state level issue you would have to take up, have a whole conversation about. A legal basis for that would be much harder to get into. But also he goes, these arguments from the left, I don't care what the left has to say. right? Notice they always will pull out like the crazy lefties from like they'll find on MSNBC and you know, CNN, all the stuff. They pick and choose their black people that they like to have represent us, just like Fox News does. It's the same thing I went back to. They'll grab these crazy people who will say, white people, you're responsible, and it's about you paying. And you turn to them and you're like all the black people turn to them like, no, it's got nothing to do with that. Right? They don't actually argue against like prominent like black community members who are pro reparations. They're arguing against straw men from crazy people on the left. And like what he did here was he switched up descendants of slaves to now just going into the topic of racism in general, which reparations doesn't have to do with that. So completely just switches up the argument.
That if you are black in America, even if you got off an airplane from Nigeria just yesterday, you are experiencing the problems and effects of white supremacy, and therefore you are owed some kinds of reparations as well. So even by the
I have literally seen no like FBA ADOS groups arguing this ever. I've only seen like crazy lefties arguing this, usually white lefties, or like I said, the ones that the mainstream media prop up on the left. Otherwise, I'm like, I have seen nobody argue this. So I have no clue where this is coming from. But then again, the only black people I've ever seen Knowles with is Tatum and Candace, so do with that what you will.
left's own arguments, this program doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's very clear what it is. It's a payoff. It's a bribe. It's a bribe from the left to a very specific interest group, to a faction, not a political party in the high-minded sense of...
It's not even for all black people, though. It's specifically for ADOS people, which is... And you have to prove it, which is, you know, that's a bit tricky when you get into census, you know, before that time, because a lot of black people didn't get counted in the census during slave time, so it can get a bit tricky. But if it was just a bribe to get the black vote, why wouldn't they go for all black people? Like, why wouldn't they just include Africans? They were arguing to include Africans. Why wouldn't they do that if that was the strategy? That's why this doesn't make any sense. I've always said if the right never ever wants to lose the black vote ever again, the right should propose some sort of federal reparations based on what was never paid. Then they will never lose the black vote again. But they won't do that because they know, unfortunately, the majority white Republican base will be enraged if they even tried that. And so they would essentially just throw out massive amounts of votes. So they can't do that unless, you know, they have to make the core of the base shift their ideas, which is not impossible because we've already seen the right took on the alphabet. They decided to take on the alphabet before black people, which is really interesting in terms of when it comes to you know, voting block numbers and also what the right says they stand for in terms of values. So it's like interesting that I was like, y'all went on the alphabet. You saw Caitlyn Jenner just got hired at Fox News. I'm like, okay, interesting.
Having an understanding and an agenda for the common good, but just an interest group and a faction. You say, we're going to pay you a little bit of money and you vote for us, and that's how it's going to work.
Not exactly. Generally speaking, black people hate Democrats. There's reasons that they vote for them, which I've explained in a lot of other videos. And it's mainly because there's a lot of spite voting going on. I don't like it. You should never spite vote. You're seeing a lot of black people switch just Republican because of Biden being absolutely horrible. And I've always been against spite voting. I've always hated it, but like I said, one side pretends to address the issues, the other side straight up will not, and on top of it, just be repulsive. The left and the right feel the same about this group. Just one will lie to you. The other will straight up tell you how they really feel. There's a reason when you look at all the popular black Republicans on the right, they all tend to say the same things, and the things they talk about primarily are for white conservatives and not for black people. Right? If you want to get more into that, you can. Malcolm X goes over that with you could use the wolf and the fox analogy when you can see, generally speaking, historically, why after a certain time period, black people tended to be repulsed by Republicans. And then a lot of times, a lot of us just feel like black conservatives. A lot of us just feel, you know, displaced. Because I'm like, look, when it comes to governmental values, I'm more libertarian. I don't agree with the conservatives. But when it comes to social values, I'm like, I'm with you all, but you all are very repulsive because it's clear you don't want people like me there. if you want me, people like me to be let in, I gotta start saying things like Tatum. And I won't do that. Sucks because both sides don't hate me, but I especially can't stand the left. But it's like, if I go to the left and I start saying, yo, like when I started, spouting traditional social views, they hate me. They think I'm some kind of like alt-right, fucking crazy. And then when I go over to the right, if I start saying pro-black things, they call me some woke lefty. And I'm just like, okay, I don't know where the hell I go.
Deeply un-American, deeply wrong, stupid, generally, and by the logic of the left. But that's the way our politics is going. Right.
And in closing, I just want to say, according to Knowles, Lincoln was the greatest president we've ever had. Well, Lincoln was the one pushing and signed off on the reparations. I would just like to point that out. The only reason it didn't get fully finished is because he was killed a month later. And that's when Johnson came in and, yeah, it's how we got where we are today. But yeah, generally, it's a start in California. Will I vote for Newsom? Hell no. Nor do I trust him with this. But, it's a start, so we'll see. And even if it went through, I still wouldn't vote for Newsom.